but I can tell you when it started. I was out for a walk alone in the woods when the entity came for me. It was beyond a blur. It was, for lack of a better term, absence of meaning. Where it hid, there were no trees. Where it crept closer, there was no grass. Through the arc it leapt at me. There was no breeze of motion. There was no air at all. Asterisk as it struck. I felt the distinct sensation of claws puncturing me somewhere unseen, somewhere I'd never felt before. My hands and arms and legs and torso seemed fine, and I wasn't bleeding, but I knew I'd been injured somehow. As I fearfully ran back home, I could tell that I was less. I was vaguely tired, and it was hard to focus at times. Asterisk, the solution at that early stage was easy. A big cup of coffee helped me feel normal again. Asterisk for a while. That subtle drain on my spirit became lost in the ebb and flow of caffeine in my system. You could say my life began that week, actually, because that was when I met Mar. She and I got along great, though, to be honest. I'm pretty sure I fell in love with her over the phone before we even met. Asterisk, it was almost as if the strong emotions of that first week made the entity fight back. It was still with me, latched on to some invisible part of my being. Asterisk, the first few incidents were minor, and I hardly worried about them. The color of a neighbor's car changed from dark blue to black one morning, and I stared at it before shaking my head and shrugging off the difference. 2 days later, at work, a coworker's name changed from Fred to Dan. I carefully asked around, but everyone said his name had always been Dan. I figured I'd just been mistaken. Asterisk then. As ridiculous as this sounds, I was peeing in my bathroom at home when I suddenly found myself on a random street. I was still in my pajamas, pants down, and urinating, but now in full view of a dozen people at a bus stop. Horrified, I pulled up my clothes and ran before someone called the cops. I did manage to get home, but the experience forced me to admit that I was still in danger. The entity was doing something to me, and I didn't understand how to fight back. Asterisk Mar showed up that evening, but she had her own key. Asterisk, hey, I asked her with confusion. How do you get a key? Asterisk, she just laughed. You're cute. Are you sure you're okay with this? She opened a door and entered a room full of boxes. I know living together is a big step, especially when we've only been dating 3 months. Asterisk, living together? I'd literally just met her the week before. Thing was, my mother had always called me a smart cookie for a reason. I knew when to shut my yap. Instead of causing a scene, I told her everything was fine, and then I went straight to my room and began investigating. Asterisk, my things were just as I had left them, with no sign of a 3-month gap in habitation. But I did find something out of the ordinary. The date. I shivered angrily as I processed the truth. The entity had eaten 3 months of my life. What the hell was I facing? What kind of creature could consume pieces of one's soul like that? I'd missed the most exciting part of a new relationship, and I would never understand any shared stories or in-jokes from that period. Something absurdly precious had been taken from me, and I was furious. Asterisk, that fury helped suppress the entity. I never imbibed alcohol. I drank coffee religiously. I checked the date every time I woke up. For 3 years, I managed to live each day while observing nothing more than minor alterations. A social fact here, and there's someone's job, how many kids they had, that sort of thing, the layout of nearby streets, the time my favorite television show aired, that kind of thing. Always, those changes reminded me the creature still had its claws sunk into my spirit. Not once in 3 years did I ever let myself zone out. Asterisk, one day, I grew careless. I let myself get really into the season finale of my favorite show. It was gripping. A fantastic story. Right at the height of the action, a young boy came up to my lounger and shook my arm. Asterisk, surprised, I asked, "Who are you?" How did you get in here? Asterisk, he laughed and smiled brightly. Silly daddy. Asterisk, my heart sank in my chest. I knew immediately what had happened. After a few masked questions, I discovered that he was 2 years old and that he was my son. Asterisk, the agony and heartache filling my chest was nearly unbearable. Not only had I missed the birth of my son, I would never see or know the first years of his life. Mar and I had obviously gotten married and started a family in the time I'd lost, and I had no idea what joys or pains those years contained. Asterisk, it was snowing outside. Holding my sudden son in my lap, I sat and watched the flakes fall outside. What kind of life was this going to be if slips in concentration could cost me years? I had to get help. Asterisk, the church had no idea what to do. The priests didn't believe me and told me I had a health issue rather than some sort of possession. Asterisk, the doctors didn't have any clue. Nothing showed up on all their scans and tests, but they happily took my money in return. For nothing. Asterisk, by the time I ran out of options, I decided to tell Mar. There was no way to know what this all looked like from her side. What was I like when I wasn't there? Did I still take our son to school? Did I still do my job? Clearly I did, because she seemed to be none the wiser. But I still had a horrible feeling that something must have been missing in her life when I wasn't actually home inside my own head. Asterisk. But the night, I set up a nice dinner in preparation. She arrived not by unlocking the front door, but by knocking on it. I answered, and found that she was in a nice dress. Asterisk, she was happily surprised by the settings on the table. A fancy dinner for a second date? I knew you were sweet on me. Asterisk, thank the Lord I knew when to keep my mouth shut. If I'd gone on about being married and having a son, she might have run for the hills. Instead, I took her coat and sat down for our second date. Asterisk, through carefully crafted questions, I managed to deduce the truth. This really was our second date. She saw relief and happiness in me, but interpreted that as dating jitters. I was just excited to realize that the entity wasn't necessarily eating whole portions of my life. The symptoms, as I was beginning to understand them, were more like the consequences of a shattered soul. The creature had wounded me, broken me into pieces. Perhaps I was to live my life out of order, but at least I would actually get to live it. Asterisk, and so it went for a few years from my perspective. While minor changes in politics or geography would happen daily, major shifts in my mental location only happened every couple months. When I found myself in a new place and time in my life, I just shut up and listened, making sure to get the lay of the land before doing anything to avoid making mistakes. On the farthest flung leap yet, I met my 6-year-old grandson, and I asked him what he wanted to be when he grew up. He said, writer. I told him it was a fine idea. Asterisk, then, I was back in month 2 of my relationship with Mar, and I had the best night with her on the riverfront. When I say the best, I mean the best. Knowing how special she would become to me, I asked her to move in. I got to live through what I'd missed the first go-around, and I came to understand that I was never mentally absent. I would always be there eventually. When we were moving her boxes in, she stopped for a moment and said she marveled at my great love, as if I'd known her for a lifetime and never once doubted she was the one. Asterisk, that was the first time I'd truly laughed freely and wholeheartedly since the entity had wounded me. She was right about my love for her, but for exactly the reason she'd considered a silly romantic analogy. I had known her my whole life, and I'd come to terms with my situation and found peace with it. It wasn't so bad to have sneak peeks at all the best parts ahead. Asterisk, but of course, I wouldn't be writing this if it hadn't gotten worse. The entity was still with me. It had not wounded me and departed like I'd wanted to believe. The closest I can describe my growing understanding was that the creature was burrowing deeper into my psyche, fracturing it into smaller pieces. Instead of months between major shifts, I began having only weeks. Once I noticed that trend, I feared my ultimate fate would be to jump between times in my life, heartbeat by heartbeat, forever confused, forever lost. Only an instant in each time meant I would never be able to speak with anyone else, never be able to hold a conversation, never express or receive love. As the true depth of that fear came upon me, I sat in an older version of me and watched the snow falling outside. That was the one constant in my life. The weather didn't care who I was or what pains I had to face. Nature was always there. The falling snow was always like a little hook that kept me in a place. The pure emotional peace it brought was like a panacea on my mental wounds. And I'd never yet shifted while watching the pattern of falling white and thinking of the times I'd gone sledding or built a snow fort as a child. A teenager touched my arm. "Grandpa?" He'd startled me out of my thoughts, so I was less careful than usual. "Who are you?" He half grinned, as if not sure whether I was joking. Handing me a stack of papers, he said, "It's my first attempt at a novel. Would you read it and tell me what you think?" Of course. Pursuing that dream of being a writer, I see. He burned bright red. Trying to, anyway. "All right. Run off. I'll read this right now." The words were blurry, and annoyed, I looked for glasses I probably had for reading. Being old was terrible, and I wanted to leap back into a younger year, but not before I read his book. I found my glasses in a sweater pocket and began leafing through. Mara puttered in and out of the living room, still beautiful, but I had to focus. I didn't know how much time I would have there. That seemed that we had relatives over. Was it Christmas? A pair of adults and a couple kids I didn't recognize tromped through the hallway, and I saw my son, now adult, walk by with his wife on the way out the door. As a group, the extended family began sledding outside. Finally, I finished reading the story, and I called out for my grandson. He rushed down the stairs and into the living room. "How was it?" "Well, it's terrible," I told him truthfully. "But it's terrible for all the right reasons. You're still a young man, so your characters behave like young people, but the structure of the story itself is very solid." I paused. I didn't expect it to turn out to be a horror story. He nodded. "It's a reflection of the times. Expectations for the future are dismal, not hopeful like they used to be. You're far too young to be aware like that," I told him. An idea occurred to me. If you're into horror, do you know anything about strange creatures? Sure, I read everything I can. I love it. Warily, I scanned the entrances to the living room. Everyone was busy outside. For the first time, I opened up to someone in my life about what I was experiencing. In hushed tones, I told him about my fragmented consciousness. For a teenager, he took it well. "You're serious?" "Yes." He donned the determined look of a grown man accepting a quest. "I'll look into it, see what I can find out. You should start writing down everything you experience. Build some data. Maybe we can map your psychic wound." "Wow, sounds like a plan." I was surprised. That made sense, and I hadn't expected him to have a serious response. "But how will I get all the notes in one place?" "Let's come up with somewhere for you to leave them," he said, frowning with thought. "Then I'll get them, and we can trace the path you're taking through your own life, see if there's a pattern." For the first time since the situation had gotten worse, I felt hope again. "How about under the stairs? Nobody ever goes under there." "Sure." He turned and left the living room. I peered after him. I heard him banging around near the stairs. Finally, he returned with a box, laid it on the carpet, and opened it to reveal a bursting stack of papers. He exclaimed, "Holy crap!" But of course, being a teenager, he didn't really say crap. Taken aback, I blinked rapidly, forgiving his cussing because of the shock. "Did I write those?" He looked up at me with wonder. Yeah, or you will. You still have to write them and put them under the stairs after this. He gazed back down at the papers and covered the box. So you probably shouldn't see what they say. That could get weird. That much I understood. Right. He gulped. There are like 50 boxes under there, all filled up like this. Deciphering these will take a very long time. His tone dropped to deadly seriousness. But I will save you, Grandpa, because I don't think anyone else can. Tears flowed down my cheeks then, and I couldn't help but sob once or twice. I hadn't realized how lonely I'd become in my shifting prison of awareness until I finally had someone who understood. Thank you. Thank you so much. And then I was young again, and at work on a random Tuesday. Once the sadness and relief faded, anger and determination replaced them. After I finished my work, I grabbed some paper and began writing. While the weeks shifted around me, while those weeks became days and then hours, I wrote every single spare moment about when and where I thought I was. I put them under the stairs out of order. My first box was actually the 30th, and my last box was the 1st. Once I had over 50 boxes written from my perspective, and once my shifting became a matter of minutes, I knew it was up to my grandson to take it from there. I put my head down and stopped looking. I couldn't stand the river of changing awareness any longer. Names and places and dates and jobs and colors and people were all wrong and different. I'd never been older. I sat watching the snowfall. A man of at least 30 that I vaguely recognized entered the room. Come on, I think I finally figured it out. I was so frail that moving was painful. Are you him? Are you my grandson? Yes. He took me to a room filled with strange equipment and sat me in a rubber chair facing a large mirror, twice the height of a man. The pattern finally revealed itself. How long have you worked on this? I asked him, aghast. Tell me you didn't miss your life like I'm missing mine. His expression was both stone cold and furiously resolute. It'll be worth it. He brought 2 thin metal rods close to my arm and then nodded at the mirror. Look, this shock is carefully calibrated. The electric zap from his device was startling, but not painful. In the mirror, I saw a rapid arcing light silhouette appear above my head and shoulder. The electricity moved through the creature like a wave, briefly revealing the terrible nature of what was happening to me. A bulging leech-like mouth was wrapped around the back of my head, coming down to my eyebrows and touching each ear. And its slug-like body ran over my shoulder and into my very soul. It was a parasite, and it was feeding on my mind. My now adult grandson held my hand as I took in the horror. After a moment, he asked, removing it is going to hurt very badly. Are you up for this? Fearful, I asked, is Mar here? His face softened. No, not for a few years now. I could tell from his reaction what had happened, but I didn't want it to be true. How? We have this conversation a lot, he responded. Are you sure you want to know? It never makes you feel better. Tears brimmed in my eyes. Then I don't care if it hurts, or if I die. I don't want to stay in a time where she's not alive. He made a sympathetic noise of understanding, and then returned to his machines to hook several wires, diodes, and other bits of technology to my limbs and forehead. While he did so, he talked. I've worked for 2 decades to figure this out, and I've had a ton of help from other researchers of the occult. This parasite doesn't technically exist in our plane. It's one of the lesser spawns of Micro Esset Micro, and it feeds on the plexus of mind, soul, and quantum consciousness reality. When details like names and colors of objects changed, you weren't going crazy. The web of your existence was merely losing strands as the creature ate its way through you. I didn't fully understand. I looked up in confusion as he placed a circlet of electronics, like a crown on my head, in exact line with where the parasite's mouth had ringed me. What's Micro? Esset Micro? He paused his work and grew pale. I forgot that you wouldn't know. You're lucky, believe me. After a deep breath, he began moving again and placed his fingers near a few switches. Ready? This is carefully tuned to make your nervous system extremely unappetizing to the parasite, but it's basically electroshock therapy. I could still see Mars smile. Even though she was dead, I'd just been with her moments ago. Do it. The click of a switch echoed in my ears, and I almost laughed at how mild the electricity was. It didn't feel like anything, at least at first. Then I saw the mirror shaking, and my body within that image convulsing. Oh, no, it did hurt. Nothing had ever been more painful. It was just so excruciating that my mind hadn't been able to immediately process a dot as my vision shook in fire, burned in every nerve in my body. I could see the reflected trembling light silhouette of the parasite on my head as it writhed in agony equal to mine. It had six clawed lizard-like limbs under its leech-like body, and it cut into me in an attempt to stay latched on. The electricity made my memories flare. Mars' smile was foremost, lit brightly in front of a warm fire as the snow fell past the window behind her. The edges of that memory began lighting up, and I realized that my life was one continuous stretch of experience. It was only the awareness of it that had been fragmented by that feasting evil on my back. I'd never managed to be there for the birth of my son. I'd jumped around it a dozen times, but never actually lived it. For the first time, I got to hold Mars' hand and be there for her. No. That moment had shifted seamlessly into holding her hand as she lay in a hospital bed for a very different reason. Not this. God, why? It was so merciless to make me remember this. I broke down in tears as nurses rushed into the room. I didn't want to know. I didn't want to experience it. I'd seen all the good parts, but I hadn't wanted the worst part, the inevitable end that all would one day face. It wasn't worth it. It was tainted. All that joy was given back 10,000-fold as pain. The fire in my body and in my brain surged to sheer white torture, and I screamed. My scream faded into a surprised shout as the machines and electricity and chair faded away. Snow was no longer falling around my life. I was out in the woods on a bright summer day. Oh God. I turned to see the creature approaching me. It was the same absence of meaning, the same blank on reality. It crept forward, just like before, but this time it hissed and turned away. I stood, astounded at being young again and freed from the parasite. My grandson had actually done it. He'd made me an unappetizing meal. So the predator of mind and soul had moved on in search of a different snack. I returned home in a daze, and while I was sitting there processing all that had happened, the phone rang. I looked at it in awe and sadness. I knew who it was. It was Marjorie, calling for the first time for some trivial reason she'd admit 30 years later was made up just to talk to me. But all I could see was her lying in that hospital bed dying. It was going to end in unspeakable pain and loneliness. I would become an old man, left to sit by myself in an empty house, his soulmate gone long before him. At the end of it all, the only thing I would have left, sitting and watching the falling snow. But now, thanks to my grandson, I would also have my memories. It would be a wild ride, no matter how it ended. On a sudden impulse, I picked up the phone. With a smile, I asked, "Hey, who's this?" Even though I already knew. While growing up, I often had opportunities to stay home alone when I was younger, since my mother and father were forced to travel because their parents were ill and lived overseas. And my much older siblings wouldn't get off work until at least an hour or two after I finished school. I was used to being home alone and actually enjoyed it. One Saturday, when I was 12, my parents had to go to a funeral for an old friend in the next city. My brother had already moved out by then, and my sister was nowhere to be found, so my parents decided to leave me home alone for the entire day. I was so excited. Being home alone for a whole day meant I could blast music and spend as much time as I wanted on the computer dot when my brother moved out. We converted his bedroom, the last one at the end of the hallway, into an office, and my computer was in there. We still had dial-up internet at the time, so my parents added an extra phone line in the house so I would stop taking up their line. I ran into the office to use what I called my personal phone line to call my friend who lived a few streets over to see if she wanted to come hang out. She was really upset. She told me she was having boyfriend problems and needed someone to talk to, so she'd be right over. I thought to myself, girl talk means we need a good treat, and ran out of the office so that I could go check out what was in the kitchen. That's when I saw her. A pale woman dressed all in black, with a black bun on her head. Her head tilted as I ran by the corner. I couldn't really see her eyes, but for some reason, I remember thinking that she was smiling. I got some serious chills and felt instantly frozen, but I ignored it, thinking I was paranoid from being alone all day, and ran down the stairs. I couldn't believe my imagination was playing tricks on itself like that. I called my friend to see if she had left yet, and since no one answered the phone at her house, I figured she had. Something still didn't feel right, so I put on my jacket and headed out to the driveway to wait for her. When she arrived, she asked me what I was doing outside. I said, something weird just happened, but I'll tell you over white-hot chocolate. And we went inside, took off our coats, and drank our hot chocolate in the kitchen, while she told me about the problems she was having with her boyfriend. Since both her boyfriend and I had webcams, and we knew he had friends over, we went into my computer room upstairs to call him and see if him and his friends wanted to web chat with us. While she was on the phone with him, I was talking to his friend on the computer and setting up my webcam. While my friend was on the phone, she turned around and looked out the door into the hallway. She told her boyfriend that she'd have to call him back. She looked at me, wide-eyed and white-faced, and said, "There's a woman in your hallway wearing a black dress." I got up from my computer chair and closed the door without looking into the hallway. I frantically tried to remember if I had told her why I was outside when she got there. I then asked her, "Didn't I mention that when you got here?" And she said, "No." And I said, "How was her hair?" And my friend said, "In a bun." We both freaked out, opened the door, made sure the coast was clear, and bolted down the stairs. I called my parents and told them I was going to my friend's house, but they told me they were a few minutes away and insisted that I wasn't leaving the house. When they got home, I told them what happened, but they didn't believe me. For the next few days, I kept thinking I was seeing her, but I wasn't sure if it was my imagination, because I was scared, or because she was really there. Weird things happened too, like the calendar in my bedroom would be upside down when I got home from school, or things would go missing from my room. Eventually, these weird occurrences stopped, but a couple of months later, we adopted a 2-year-old cat. From the moment she was brought home, all the way up to today, she has 3 or 4 random corners of the house that she meows at constantly. And every once in a while, after meowing at a particular spot, she shrieks and runs away as fast as she can. One of these spots is in my bedroom, and lately she's been meowing at it every night. I barely slept in the motel. Calling it sleep at all feels wrong. It was more like falling in and out of shallow black water, every dream carrying that same dragging sound from under the cabin floor. Every time I jolted awake, my first instinct was to check the door, the windows, the corners. Asterisk, the room never felt warm. Not once. Asterisk, when I finally sat up for good around 6 a.m., Though the digital clock kept flickering like it was losing power, the cold was still in my bones. Not the kind of cold from bad insulation or autumn air. This was the lake's cold. That deep bite that feels like it comes from below you. Asterisk, and when I stood up, I noticed something I didn't remember from the night before. There were granules of lake mud on the motel carpet. Small, dark flecks smeared near the foot of the bed. I stared at them for a long time, trying to convince myself I'd tracked them in without noticing. But I had kicked my shoes off at the door, and they were bone dry. No mud on the soles. Nothing on the doormat. Asterisk, when I grabbed my uncle's journal from the knitstand, my stomach twisted. It was damp. Not wet enough to drip. Asterisk, just cool and soft around the edges, like it had been sitting in humidity, or held by someone with wet hands. Asterisk, I didn't want to think about either possibility. I went to the bathroom, splashed my face, and tried to tell myself the night before was a shock reaction. Panic, adrenaline mixing with childhood memories of the lake. My mind kept forming rational explanations out of habit. Asterisk, but then I tried to call my parents. Straight to voicemail. Not ringing first. Not a weak signal. Straight to that blunt automated message. Asterisk, something about it felt wrong. Like the phone wasn't off. It was unreachable. My uncle's number did the same. By the third attempt, I stopped trying because the motel room felt smaller every time the call failed. I decided to get moving. My plan was simple. Drive home. Tell someone, maybe a Park Service officer, what I saw, and let professionals handle the rest. The parking lot was empty when I stepped outside. My car sat alone beneath a buzzing street lamp. Early sunshine barely cutting through the haze. Asterisk. Every step felt heavier the closer I got to the driver's side door. Asterisk. When I opened the car, the first thing I noticed was the smell. Asterisk, not rot. Not mold. Asterisk, lake water. Cold and metallic. Asterisk, I sat there for several minutes, keys in hand, waiting for the fear to settle. It didn't, but I drove anyway, because the last thing I wanted was to stay still long enough for anything from the cabin to catch up. Asterisk, I told myself I was leaving for. Good. I meant it, but something pulled me back. Asterisk, the farther I got from the lake, the more guilt gnawed at me. I left my uncle. I watched him disappear toward the trees, and then nothing. Asterisk, I ran until the woods blurred together and didn't stop until I reached the parking lot. Lungs screaming, legs numb. I didn't even try to look for him once I reached the road. Asterisk, I told myself it was survival, but every mile between me and the lake made the truth feel uglier. Creature could have chased me. It didn't, which means something stopped it, or someone. I pulled into a rest stop and opened the journal again, willing it to give me something rational, something that made leaving him behind acceptable. Asterisk instead. I found the page with the circled coordinates, a rough sketch of the lake, wobbly lines marking the shoreline. A spot on the northern inlet circled so many times the ink bled through the paper. Asterisk below it, written in ink darker than the rest. It rises here first. I stared at the words until my chest hurt. I tried to imagine leaving, driving home, pretending none of this mattered. Asterisk, but the image that kept returning was my uncle's hand gripping my arm, ice cold and trembling. I couldn't leave without knowing what happened to him, so I turned the car around. Asterisk, back to the lake. In daylight this time, it didn't help. If anything, the sunlight made everything worse. Daylight removes excuses. You can't blame fear on shadows or tricks of the night, but the woods were utterly still. No movement, no birds, not even the hum of insects. The cabin looked empty, in a hollow, staged way. Asterisk, like the set of a play after everyone has gone home. but I knew something had moved through since I fled. Asterisk, there were damp prints leading from the tree line toward the porch. Not footprints more, like smears. As if something wet had dragged itself along the ground. Asterisk, the porch boards were warped, buckled slightly outward. The front door hung partially open. Asterisk inside. The ash markings on the floor, the ones my uncle said kept it out, were smudged in several places. Not blurred by feet. Disturbed. Distorted. Like something uncertain of its shape had pressed against them. Asterisk, the air in the cabin was cold enough that my breath fogged. Asterisk, I didn't stay long. Asterisk, the trees behind the cabin told me one thing. My uncle didn't get far. It didn't take long to find signs of him. A torn scrap of his jacket snagged on a bramble. Heavy drag marks carving shallow lines through the moss. Asterisk, in a deep depression in the ground. Like someone had knelt there, or been forced down. No blood. That somehow made it worse. Asterisk on the next page of the journal. Written almost frantically. Asterisk, it doesn't always kill. Sometimes it keeps. My hands shook too badly to close the book properly. I followed the shoreline using his sketches. All roads led to the same spot. Asterisk, the circled inlet, was a narrow pocket of water where the lake bed dropped sharply. Asterisk, the water was unnatural for midday, too still, too dark. Asterisk, on the bank, I found a rope tied around a pine. The end frayed violently. Something had pulled it apart. And in the mud, half faded in the sun. Wet prints. Asterisk, not shaped like feet. Not paws. Asterisk, they looked improvised. Like something changing shape, adjusting to land, relearning how to move. I wanted to run again. Asterisk, but something under a cluster of rocks caught my eye, a bundle wrapped in waterproof plastic. Inside were sketches. Pages and pages of my uncle's drawings. Asterisk, anatomy of the creature. Studies of its limbs. Asterisk, the body is mostly fish-slick hide, no scales, skin that looks boiled and then rehardened. But the legs don't belong to anything that swims. Jointed like a deer's, but wrong in the angles, like something imitating a deer after only hearing it described once. Asterisk, teeth like a piranha's, but too many rows. When it closes its mouth, the jaw doesn't hinge the way a jaw should. It slides. Looks like it's for stripping, not chewing. Strange. Asterisk, it shouldn't be able to climb with those legs, but it somehow makes it work. The sound is the worst part. Hooves on wet rock, like something trotting up from the bottom. Asterisk, the eyes never shine. Light hits them and disappears. Blacker than the lake. Notes on how it emerges from the water. One sequence was labeled, asterisk, when it leaves the water. Asterisk, the shapes didn't match what I'd seen exactly. Some of the drawings looked like earlier versions, like it grows, adapts, learns. Then I heard it. A voice drifted across the water, soft, calm, calling my name. Asterisk, it sounded like my uncle, but the cadence was wrong. Asterisk, not panicked, not strained, conversational. The echo didn't match the distance. Asterisk, and after a few seconds, the voice repeated the exact same phrase with the exact same timing. Asterisk, come down to the dock. I need to tell you what's going on. My stomach dropped. My uncle never let me go past the first planks of the dock. Asterisk, and he sure as hell wouldn't use that voice. I didn't answer. I didn't move. Asterisk. The voice tried again. Same words, same tone. I could practically feel the water waiting. Asterisk, I made my choice. I wouldn't go to the dock. Wouldn't go near the water. Asterisk. If my uncle escaped, he'd have gone uphill. Away from the shoreline. Away from the lake's pull. I started backing toward the ridge when something broke the water's surface. Asterisk. Not the creature. An object. a flashlight my uncle's still flickering underwater, like someone had turned it on recently and placed it gently beneath the surface. Asterisk, waiting to be seen. I felt something watching me. Close. I stepped back too quickly, and the journal slipped from my hand, falling open on the damp ground. It didn't fall to the last page. Asterisk, it fell to a page, I swear, I hadn't read. The handwriting wasn't my uncle's. The ink was darker, fresher, wetter. Asterisk, it said, asterisk, I told you not to come in the fall. It's awake now, and it remembers you. It was 3 days ago when I first saw him. I had been working late, and I arrived at my apartment building just after midnight. I was exhausted, but happy to finally be home. It was quiet, and I made it up to the 3rd floor without seeing anyone. But when the elevator doors creaked open, I noticed a hunched shape at the end of the hall, just past 308. At first, I thought it was one of the maintenance guys. The light above them flickered, so it took a few seconds for my eyes to make sense of the silhouette. They stood in front of old Mrs. Danvers' apartment. Or rather, they were pressed up against her door. One hand braced on the doorframe, and the other curled into a fist. I cleared my throat as I walked, and the person didn't move. They just stood there, facing her door and oblivious to my arrival. I felt uncomfortable moving past the strange figure, whose face remained downturned. I felt my skin crawl a bit, and shuffled past them to my door as quickly and quietly as I could, fumbled for my key, and just as the lock turned and the door opened, I glanced back over, and the strange person was looking at me. There was something wrong with their eyes. It looked like they were too wide for the size of the head. The color was off as well. They were a shade of gray I had never seen in a person. The skin below each eye seemed pulled too tight, as if this person had been awake for days. When their gaze met mine, I thought for a heartbeat that they might ask for help. There was a raw, wincing need in that stare. Instead, their lips peeled back in a way that wasn't quite right. I quickly stepped inside and closed and locked the door. I let out a breath and tried to calm down. I threw the deadbolt on the door for good measure, and the reassurance of the heavy bolt let me relax a bit. I did not know why, but something about that person felt off. They were not doing anything threatening, but the way they stood there outside my neighbor's door, and the way they looked at me when I entered my own was disturbing. Almost an hour passed, and I was too wired to sleep. I sat on my couch watching some TV to try and relax. After a while, I was finally feeling sleepy and went to my bedroom. I woke up after only an hour to a sound through the wall. It was a voice, thin and papery, like it was being pressed through several layers and still managing to make it to me. It was Mrs. Danvers' unit, I realized. The other side of my wall should have been silent at that hour, since the old woman's sleep pattern was like clockwork. I pressed my ear to the drywall. It was hard to tell if it was her or not. At first, there was just a shushing sound and a low, wet whimper. Then a strange voice spoke. "He is there," it rasped, and it was followed by a rhythmic scratching. A back and forth sound, as if someone was using their fingernail to saw slowly at the wall. I jerked back, heart stuttering, and waited. The silence that followed was heavy. I stared at the dividing wall, half expecting to see it pulse or bulge, and finally retreated to the living room with a blanket and my phone. I didn't know why, but I felt a discomforting notion that the voices were talking about me. I crept closer to my door, and on a hunch I decided to look outside. When I summoned the courage to look out the peephole, I nearly fell back and let loose a scream. It was that man's face. He was looking directly at my door, just staring motionless and unblinking. I heard a low mumble and realized he was saying something, just under his breath, while barely moving his lips at all. "He is there. He is there. He is there." The sight of the murmuring, deranged-looking man was disturbing. I forced myself to breathe and try and calm down. The deadbolt was secure. I was safe. I pressed my palm against the door and called out, my voice cracking on the first attempt. "Listen," I said, checking my phone's glow. "It's 2:35 in the morning. I can see you standing there. I'm giving you 30 seconds to leave before I call the police. This is private property. Do you even live here?" The man's face didn't move, but the chant grew louder, the words threading through the door and setting my teeth on edge. I waited, but he didn't answer, didn't even blink, just kept repeating, "He is there. He is there. He is there," as though the words themselves were enough to conjure something behind me in the dark of the entryway. Finally, I had had enough. I called 911 and reported a trespasser, and fortunately, despite the late hour, someone answered promptly, and I explained the situation. They said they would send someone right over. Once I got back to the door to check, the disturbing figure had left. I don't know what I expected when the police arrived. Maybe a sudden burst of action, a show of force meant to put me at ease. Instead, I got a couple of tired-looking officers who asked if I had been drinking and if I was absolutely sure about what I'd seen. I pointed out the exact spot where the man had stood. I even did my best to imitate the unblinking stare and the strange cadence of his voice, which in retrospect made me feel ridiculous, like a child telling adults about the monster in the closet. They left, telling me that if something happened again to contact the apartment manager about security, but nothing illegal was happening for them to do anything about. I was upset and concerned over what had happened, but was just grateful that the man had left. I locked up again and went back to my room to try and get a few fitful hours of sleep before morning. I woke up the next day exhausted. When I left for work, I held my breath and half expected the weird man to be waiting in the hall again, but fortunately it was empty. I went back downstairs and shuffled outside. I found myself feeling grateful to be out of the building for a while. It was a long day, but the monotony of my job helped calm my mind a bit. When I was returning home, I was dismayed to see police outside the building. When I reached the 3rd floor, I saw 2 officers hunched in a soft conference with the building manager. Half the hallway was covered in police tape. Mrs. Danvers' door stood wide open, surrounded by a corona of shattered glass. My stomach dropped. I glanced at my own door and saw no sign of a break-in. Yet that wasn't the consolation it should have been. I must have stood in the hall for a minute. The officers noticed me and drew me in. "You're a neighbor?" one asked. I nodded and gave my name. She wrote it down with the lethargy of someone who expected nothing new. "Last time you saw or heard from Mrs. Danvers?" she asked. Got my mind, replayed the shushing and scratching, the creeping sounds from the other side of my wall. "Not very recently, though last night," I said, "after midnight. I heard. I thought someone was at her door." I stopped, unsure if I should mention the voice I thought I heard through the wall. My anxiety grew, and I felt guilty. I knew I should have called someone when I saw that weird guy by her door. I should have helped her, not just hide in my apartment. The officer nodded and continued. "Her nephew found her this morning. Looks like a break-in, but there's nothing much missing. No forced entry. Whoever did it left the locks in place behind them." The officer gestured at the splintered frame, now haphazardly propped up with yellow tape. "Did you see or hear anything else? Anyone strange hanging around?" I hesitated, sweat prickling in my palms. There was someone. A man. I saw him late last night, maybe 2 or 3. I swallowed. He was just standing there. I called you guys, but by the time police got here, he was gone. The other cop, a heavy-set guy with tired eyes, looked up from his notepad. "And you get a good look at him? Height, hair, clothes?" I started to describe the face, but the words tripped on each other. Gray eyes, those two tight features, a mouth that had smiled without really moving. I lapsed into silence after only a sentence or two. The cop's eyebrows inched upward, just barely. You think he lives here? I've never seen him before, I admitted. Not once, and I've been here nearly 2 years. He wrote down some notes. Well, if you see him again, don't open the door, okay? Call us right away. And talk to your landlord if there's anything else you need, the woman said. Stay safe. I nodded, and the word safe lingered in my head. I squeezed past the cluster of uniforms into my apartment. I locked the door behind me. Then I locked it again, as if the second click of metal would somehow double the protection. I thought of Mrs. Danvers' door, splintered, no forced entry. Like whoever had come for her didn't need to force anything. I pictured the precise, careful way that man's hand hovered over the door, how easily he could have slid inside. I called my friend Seth to see if I could crash at his place that night, since this whole situation was making me feel nervous. But he was out of town on an impromptu vacation, and I did not have anyone else nearby I could stay with. I decided to buy a Ring cam for my door and monitor it for any sign of that creepy guy. Once it was done, I caught myself staring at the live feed every 20 minutes. Each check felt both paranoid and necessary, like checking that your car is still locked even when you can see it from your window. That night, I made an effort at normalcy. I reheated dinner and watched some TV. I ignored the pressure in my chest until it went away, or at least until I convinced myself it had. When I finally crawled into bed, it was with the lights on. My phone rested within arm's reach, the camera feed open in the corner of the screen, the blue glow painting the ceiling in restless waves. I was restless, and my mind kept moving from one paranoid fantasy to the next. At 2:09 a.m., my phone buzzed. It was a motion notification from the camera in the hallway. I scrambled upright, yanking the phone to my face, but the app feed was frozen on a dull blue rectangle. I jabbed the refresh and squinted at the screen. There was someone in the hall, just beyond the bullseye of view, where the camera's lens distorted them into a blurred, twitching oval. I held my breath and waited for the image to sharpen. The live video hiccuped, then caught up. It was the same man, his eyes somehow even wider in the night vision mode. He stood in profile, just staring at my door, the way an astronomer might stare through a telescope at some distant, decaying planet. Then he moved, a spasmodic half-step, head jerking in a way that made my neck ache to look at. He bent down, nearly folding in half, to peer at the number plate attached to my apartment. His finger hovered a fraction above the digits, and he started tapping them. He looked straight into the camera then. His face was vibrating slightly in the low-light pixelation, and his lips pulled back again, not a smile, but a peeling away, like bark flaking off an old tree. I realized that he was mouthing the words again. He is there. He is there. My muscles locked in place, a cold paralysis seizing my limbs as I stared at the screen. The dread pooling in my gut felt heavier than before, weighed down by the certainty that this man had something to do with the splintered door across the hall, and whatever had happened to Mrs. Danvers behind it. My fear broke just long enough to come to my senses and call the police again. The dispatcher answered, and I rattled off my address between tight breaths. I'd like to think I sounded rational, but I could barely string thoughts together. All I could do was insist, over and over, that the man was back and he was just standing there. I watched the screen while I spoke, ready to describe everything. His build, the color of his coat, any detail I could scavenge from the camera's stuttering stream. The dispatcher promised help, and when I hung up, I still felt a surge of anxiety. The time between the call and the arrival of the officers dragged on. I waited, cross-legged in the middle of my kitchen, phone in one hand and the largest knife I owned in the other. Each time I refreshed the Ring feed, I saw the man return, peering in, growing bolder, as if my repeated calls for help were only invitations. Every few minutes, the pale gap of his face would drift across the camera's periphery, closer each time, lips mouthing the phrase, "He is there." I gripped the knife tighter when I heard the handle to the door rattling, like he was trying it to see if it was unlocked. When the police finally arrived, I wouldn't have known it except for the distorted blue flash it briefly splashed against the corridor wall, brilliant and spectral through the peephole. The man outside my door recoiled from the light, or maybe just melted away, because one moment he was there, and the next he seemed to have evaporated. I pressed my eye to the glass and watched as two officers, different from last night, swept down the hallway. One stopped in front of my door and gently knocked. I unlocked the door and let them in, the bright LED beams scanning every corner of my single-bedroom apartment as though a murderer might lunge from behind my laundry basket. Despite what had happened to Mrs. Danvers, the officers barely spent 5 minutes sweeping my apartment before they exchanged that look, the one that said I was just another paranoid tenant with an overactive imagination. My pulse hammered in my throat as I begged them to check. Again, to look harder, but their reassurances felt like nails in my coffin. "We'll patrol the area," one said, hand already on his holster, eager to leave. The door closed behind them with a sound like a death sentence, and I was alone again with whatever had been watching me through the camera dot as soon as the door shut. I jammed the deadbolt home again and slumped against the door, suddenly so tired it felt like my bones had turned to jelly. I left the kitchen light on and slept upright on the couch, phone on knee, knife against thigh. I managed to force myself to get some sleep, but my mind lingered on the figure haunting my doorstep dot. The next night, the whole terrible process was repeated, with a slight change. I got home on edge, but no one was there. I rushed inside, and sure enough, after trying to sleep for a while, my phone buzzed. On the screen, haloed in the glitchy blue night vision, was the man's face inches from the peephole, teeth showing, in a way that wasn't a smile or a snarl, but a slow, deliberate bearing. His lips trembled as he whispered, "He is there. He is there. He is there." I heard the sound of paper sliding under my door. I froze. It took a full minute before I finally crawled across the room and knelt at the entrance, unwilling to expose so much as a knuckle to the air beyond the threshold. The paper was no thicker than a receipt, folded twice and pinched at the edge where it had been pushed beneath the frame. I used the tip of the knife to drag it closer, then flicked it open with the least possible movement. There was writing on. It's shaky and cramped, the sort of print you'd expect from a hand not used to holding a pen. "He is there. He is waiting for you." That was it. It was just the same warning repeated and repackaged in a new, more permanent form, as if the words themselves had more power now that I could see them. I checked the camera again, but to my surprise, he left before I could call for help again. I spent the rest of the night on the floor, knife in one hand, the note in the other, as if both could somehow balance each other out and keep me alive until morning. At around 4 a.m, my phone died, the screen flickering dark. I stayed there, awake, and counted the heartbeats. At some point, I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, I saw daylight leaking through the window. I checked my watch and saw it was almost noon. My jaw ached from clenching it, and my phone, when I plugged it in, refused to take a charge. The screen stubbornly insisted on 0%. I groaned when I realized my charger was broken somehow. I checked the hallway camera from my laptop out of paranoia, and there was nothing. Not a trace he had ever been there, besides the note I had left on the floor. I stayed home from work, since I did not feel like risking going outside. I slept again for a few hours, but when darkness fell, I was anxious again. I stayed up late, and when the time passed 2:30 and I had received no alarms, I relaxed and thought I might be all right for the night. But at 3:35, I woke with a start. I heard that disturbing scratching, but no motion alarm. I looked to my phone, and it was dead. I checked my laptop, and when I booted it up, it threw sparks into the air, and I saw to my horror, a knife had been stabbed through the top of it. I shot to my feet and nearly tripped. I scrambled for the light, but when I went to turn them on, the switch failed. I tried to control my terrified breathing in the dark room. I fumbled through my drawers and found an old flashlight I kept for emergencies. And mercifully, the batteries were still good. I shined the light around my bedroom in a panic. There was nothing at first, but I held my hand over my mouth to suppress the gasp as I saw a message scrawled across my wall in red paint that read, "I am here." I wanted to scream, but I had the sense that making noise would only trigger something far worse. I carefully pulled the knife out of my laptop and gripped it so hard my knuckles turned white. I cautiously stepped toward the door, shining the light all around, looking for any sign of an intruder. The cold from the tiles seeped through my bare feet, and I realized I was shivering hard enough to rattle my teeth. I kept scanning the room for any sign of movement. I tried to slow my breathing and take stock. If something had gotten in, it would be in there with me, but I saw nothing, except near the foot of my bed, just within the cone of the flashlight beam, sat a black gym bag. It definitely hadn't been there when I went to sleep. Every muscle in my back locked up until my whole body buzzed with pins and needles. I circled it, knife drawn, as though half expecting some animal to leap out at me. The zipper was open. Inside, I caught a jumble of thick twisted cord and brownish cotton rags, knotted around objects I could not identify. I forced myself to open the mouth of the bag wider. The first thing I saw was a length of thick rope. Under that, a battered roll of duct tape, the edges chewed and frayed down to the cardboard ring. The bottom held 2 stubby white candles, already half-burned, and an unmarked pill bottle filled with strange unidentified black pills. At the very bottom, glinting in the light, a set of tools that should have belonged to an emergency dentist or a mechanic. Tiny pliers, scalpel, a drill, something like a sharpened file. I saw a slight tingle of red of some of the sharper implements and recoiled. I backed up and tripped over something. I bumped hard into the dresser, and the sound shook the floor. My hand moved to cover my mouth and still, and listened in terrible anticipation. I thought about running. I thought about the window. It was the 3rd floor, but maybe I'd make it. Better a broken leg than whatever might happen if I stayed. I even thought of locking myself in the bathroom, as though the thin door could actually keep anyone out. But I just stood there in the musty dark, clutching the knife and the flashlight, building a fantasy in my head where I would see the intruder coming and have time to stab or scream or do anything but freeze. Then I heard it again, a faint scratching, louder and closer than it had been the night before. I slipped out of my bedroom and aimed the flashlight at the front door. A massive figure stood there, motionless. They were much larger than the strange man who had been waiting outside my door. Where a face should have been was only a pale, concave mask, bone-white and misshapen. My stomach lurched. I stepped back. The floor creaked. The mask turned toward me with terrible slowness. It resembled melted wax poured over living flesh, translucent and sagging. Gaping eye holes revealed only darkness. Below them, an unseen jaw worked mechanically, grinding like teeth through wet fabric. And the figure spoke one word in a cracked, horrible voice. "You." They advanced with mechanical precision, one shoulder dragging, body lurching in a broken rhythm. I screamed and hurled the knife. but it only grazed fabric. The mask cocked sideways, surprised by resistance. I tried to rush forward and kick the person, but a single shove sent me skidding across the kitchen floor, flashlight spinning away. Above me, a disk of light swung wildly across the ceiling as the figure's stuttering silhouette closed in. I tried to scramble upright, shoes slipping on old grease and dust. The looming figure lurched after me, boots pounding the tiles hard enough to splinter bone. I barely made it around the chipped laminate counter when the edge of his palm snatched the back of my shirt. The fabric tightened, air knocked from my chest, and I smashed straight into the linoleum, the cold knocking sparks into my vision. They knelt on my back, and blackness edged my vision as I felt a rope wrap around my neck. In my desperation, I managed to grab something. My hand found the coffee mug I dropped yesterday. It had not broken when I dropped it. I grasped the handle and swung hard, connecting with the head of my attacker. They reeled back, and I used the space to lunge for the door, unlock it, and stumble into the hallway where the old man stood waiting. He regarded me and pointed. No, not at me, but behind me into my apartment. He is there. Isn't he? I looked back and saw the large figure rising and stumping back towards me. I flew past the weird old man in a mad rush and wondered if he had known the other man was in my apartment all along. I raced out of the hall, down the stairs, and burst through the lobby doors. I sprinted across the freezing parking lot in my socks. My hands shook so badly, I dropped my keys twice before unlocking my car. I couldn't look back at the windows, couldn't bear to see if that mask was watching. The car's interior lights stuttered as I started the engine, my knuckles white on the wheel. I kept on driving for a long while. I finally thought to plug my phone in, and when it had enough of a charge back, I heard it buzz with a notification. I ignored it at first, then realized it was the same number that had called me back after my first 911 report. The local police line. I listened to a message saying that someone had broken into several apartments in my building and that they found my apartment open, and signs of the struggle were evident. Unfortunately, the person who attacked me was not found. I have no idea who it was or what they wanted to do to me, besides what terrible things I could conjure in my mind based on the contents of that bag and what had happened to my neighbor. Since then, I have had to find a new place to stay. If whoever that was is still out there, my room, my building, none of it is safe anymore. The old man's face still haunts me as well. Those sunken eyes that had seen the horror waiting in my apartment while I remained blind to it. He wasn't my enemy. He was trying to warn me, in his own strange way, about whoever had been lurking in my home, breathing my air, watching me sleep. I still wonder what happened to him, and just how he knew what he knew. I check every closet now, look under my bed. I've installed 3 deadbolts and sleep with a baseball bat. But locks don't seem to matter when that giant had managed to sneak into my house. I just hope he does not find me again, or anyone else for that matter. I made it out alive this time. But sometimes a warning comes too.